One whisper shattered the quiet. "You have my Admiral's son's eyes." In the next breath, a collapse. In the next chapter, a family lost to duty found again through grace. But that illusion was seconds from shattering. At table 6, a woman in deep plum and pearls, Eleanor Wright, dignified and known for her silence since her husband's passing, raised her eyes just as a young waitress approached. The girl wore a crisp green vest over her white blouse, her steps efficient, her smile professional. But as Eleanor caught her gaze, time stalled. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hand rose slowly, not in formality, but in instinct. And in a trembling voice, she whispered the words that sent a ripple through the room. "You have my Admiral's son's eyes." Across the dining hall, a man in a white naval uniform jerked forward in his seat. Admiral Thomas Wright, Eleanor's son and a decorated pillar of the military, clutched his chest with a sudden gasp. His metals shifted as he tried to stand, but his knees buckled, and in a single, horrifying moment, he collapsed onto the marble floor. Glasses tipped, chairs scraped, and silence, followed by cries of alarm, swept through the room. If you believe in buried truths, in family secrets that refuse to stay hidden, and in the redemptive power of love, stay with us. Because what happened next unraveled a legacy no one was ready to confront. The waitress's name was Grace Miller. 24 years old, she worked long shifts to support her ailing father and had never once believed her quiet life could be touched by the world of admirals or emerald-draped grandmothers. But what began as a strange whisper from an elegant stranger would lead Grace to a truth more staggering than any uniform or bloodline. It wasn't just about the eyes. It was about everything that had been hidden behind them. Grace Miller had always known she didn't belong to the world of chandelier dining rooms and pearl-strung patrons. But after the Admiral's collapse and the old woman's cryptic whisper, she felt even more like a trespasser, not just in the Harbor Club, but in her own life. That evening, after her shift, she walked home in silence, her footsteps echoing on the damp concrete. The sounds of the city, honking cars, humming street lamps, the murmur of strangers, seemed to fade behind the louder questions spinning in her chest. Why did she say that? She tossed and turned all night, unable to shake the image of Eleanor's trembling hand or the eerie way their eyes had locked. That wasn't a casual remark, it was something guttural, something born from grief. Grace had served hundreds of patrons before, and never once had someone looked at her like that. Like they were seeing a ghost. Like they were remembering someone long dead. By morning, the buzz had already started. Her coworkers huddled near the service station, whispering behind menus and coffee trays. "Did you see it?" one asked. "The Admiral?" "I heard he flatlined for 20 seconds. But their voices dropped further when she entered, their eyes flicking to her face with something between curiosity and suspicion. Grace kept her head down and moved through the shift like a machine. Still, she could feel it, the stares, the questions no one dared to ask aloud. She knew how fast gossip traveled in a place like the Harbor Club. Waitresses, no matter how hardworking, were rarely the center of attention, and yet now, she was the center of everything. And she hated it. She slipped away during her break and stepped outside, the cool air sharp against her flushed cheeks. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket, intending to check on her dad, but a headline caught her eye instead. Admiral Thomas Wright collapses during luncheon, bystander identified as local waitress. Her heart sank. Below the headline was a photo, blurry, zoomed in, but unmistakably her, holding Eleanor's hand. Frozen in that moment, she didn't know what unnerved her more, the way the article framed it, or the caption that read, "Witnesses say the Admiral's mother reacted emotionally to the young woman before the collapse." Suddenly, she felt small, exposed. Like her world, the world she had kept simple and private, had been cracked wide open by a stranger's grief. That evening, after checking in on her father and making him tea, Grace sat on the floor of her tiny bedroom. A shoebox rested in her lap, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were the few things her father had kept after her mother's death: a worn baby blanket, a hospital wristband with her name, and a photo, faded, folded in half, of a woman holding a newborn. Her mother. Lillian, though Grace had never heard that name spoken out loud. Her father had never spoken much about her mother. Whenever Grace asked, he'd simply say, "She loved you," and change the subject. He never said how they met, or what she was like, or even what happened to her. The only detail he'd ever offered was that she died in a car accident when Grace was a baby. But the way he said it, carefully, almost rehearsed, never quite felt like the full truth. Grace stared at the photo, the woman's face soft with affection. There was something familiar in her eyes, the same kind of depth that Eleanor's had when she looked at her. And suddenly, that whisper echoed again in Grace's mind, "You have my Admiral's son's eyes." She didn't know what it meant, but it didn't feel like a mistake. The next morning, there was a crisp cream envelope waiting for her on the hostess stand. Her name was written in elegant script across the front, Miss Grace Miller. Her heart picked up speed as she opened it. The message was short but formal. "I would like very much to speak with you. There are things I must explain. Eleanor Wright." For a moment, Grace just stood there, stunned. Her mind whirled with possibilities. Did this woman really know something about her past? Could her mother, the woman in that photograph, have been connected to the Wright family? She folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, the paper warm from her hand. A part of her wanted to run, to pretend it never happened and return to the life she understood. But another part, quiet and pulsing, urged her to face the woman who had looked at her with such certainty. Maybe, just maybe, Eleanor had answers her father never gave. After her shift, Grace found herself standing outside her father's room, the note still in her pocket. He was sitting up in bed, thumbing through a worn mystery novel. His cough had worsened lately, and she worried every time she left him alone. "Dad," she said gently, "do you remember Mom's full name?" He blinked up at her, his eyes soft with age but sharp with caution. "Why?" I found a note. From someone who thinks she might have known her." He looked away, and for the first time in a long time, Grace saw fear in his face. "Her name was Lillian Hayes," he said quietly after a long pause. "But we didn't talk about her much because it hurt. For both of us." Grace sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. "Do you know if she ever knew anyone named Wright? Or Thomas Wright?" The name landed like a rock in the room. Her father's shoulders stiffened. He didn't answer, not right away. Then, in a strained voice, he said, "It's better to leave certain names buried, Grace." But the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. She didn't push him further. She simply nodded, kissed his forehead, and left the room, her thoughts spinning faster than she could catch them. There were too many coincidences, too many cracks in the story she'd grown up believing. And now, someone from a world far beyond hers wanted to talk. That night, Grace lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eleanor's trembling hands. She saw the way the Admiral collapsed. She heard her father's warning, but louder than all of that was the feeling in her gut that something was missing, something big. She knew she couldn't keep pretending this was nothing. The letter was real. The recognition was real. And the pain in Eleanor's face, that had been the most real of all. If there was even a chance this woman held the truth, Grace had to hear it. The next day, after her shift ended, Grace didn't go straight home. Instead, she took a cab uptown, following the address Eleanor had included at the bottom of the letter. The neighborhood changed quickly from concrete and corner stores to manicured hedges and gated estates. Her heart thudded in her chest as the car pulled to a stop outside a sprawling colonial home with ivy trailing the walls. She stepped out slowly, smoothing the wrinkles in her coat. The sun was beginning to set, casting the driveway in soft amber light. The door opened before she knocked. Eleanor stood there, framed by warm hallway light, her eyes still glistening with recognition and regret. "Grace," she said, her voice both trembling and certain. "Thank you for coming." And in that moment, Grace knew this wasn't just a meeting. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but needed to understand. Grace had never seen a house like this outside of magazines, the kind on thick, glossy paper with headlines about heirlooms and legacies. The wrought iron gates had opened silently when the cab pulled up, revealing a long driveway lined with flowering hedges and trees trimmed with quiet precision. The house itself was an ivy-covered colonial, its windows glowing like lanterns in the fading evening light. Everything about it whispered wealth, not the kind that flaunted itself, but the kind that didn't need to. Grace smoothed her coat again as she stood on the porch, trying not to feel like she'd stepped into a dream she hadn't been invited to. Eleanor stood in the doorway, dressed in a deep blue cardigan over a silk blouse, her pearls catching the soft foyer light. "Come in, dear," she said gently, her voice layered with both warmth and worry. Grace stepped inside and was greeted by a world of polished wood floors, paintings in gold frames, and the faint scent of lavender and something older, like cedar and memory. The silence inside wasn't empty, it was reverent, as though the house itself held its breath. Eleanor led her through a hallway lined with black and white photographs, most of them of naval ceremonies and formal portraits. They entered a parlor where tea had already been set, delicate china cups, shortbread on a plate, and a teapot that looked older than Grace. Eleanor gestured to the sofa, then poured the tea with practiced hands, the pearls around her neck shifting gently with every movement. Grace sat stiffly, feeling out of place in her thrift store coat and scuffed shoes, but Eleanor said nothing of appearances. Instead, she placed a photo frame on the coffee table between them and turned it so Grace could see. "This," she said softly, "is the woman I believe was your mother." The photo inside the frame was old, its edges faded, its colors softened by time. But the face looking back at Grace stole the breath from her lungs. The woman had the same cheekbones, the same curve of the mouth, even the same soft arch to the brows that Grace saw in the mirror every day. The only difference was in the eyes. The woman's were painted with a kind of light Grace had never known in her own. "That's her," Grace whispered, her fingers barely brushing the glass. "That's my mother." Eleanor nodded, her own hands trembling slightly as she set the teapot down. Her name was Lillian Hayes. She was an artist, talented, vibrant, stubborn in all the best ways. Her voice faltered, but she kept speaking. "My son, Thomas, he met her during a community arts fundraiser at the naval base. He was young, newly commissioned, still carrying more ideals than caution." Grace listened in silence, the tea forgotten in her hands. Eleanor's words came slowly, like someone peeling back a memory they had long kept locked away. They fell in love quickly. But Lillian wasn't from a naval family, no pedigree, no connections. Just talent and a free spirit. "I didn't think she was right for him." She looked down ashamed. "I said things I regret. I told Thomas that if he continued seeing her, he would be throwing away his future. That no admiral's son should be tied to someone so unproven." Grace flinched at the word, and Eleanor caught herself. "I see now how wrong that was. But at the time, I believed I was protecting him." They tried to keep seeing each other, Eleanor continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But the pressure was relentless from his commanding officers, from me, from everyone who thought they knew best." She paused, collecting herself. "Eventually, he gave in. He ended it. He didn't tell her why, only that he couldn't continue." She left without a word. Grace's chest felt heavy, her throat dry. "And that was the last time he saw her?" Eleanor hesitated. "As far as I knew, yes." Her gaze drifted to the photograph again. "But what I didn't know is that she was pregnant when she left." The words fell into the room like a weight, pressing against everything that had come before. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Her heart pounded in her ears, louder than the ticking of the ornate wall clock behind them. You think I'm his daughter." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Grace's. "I don't just think it, Grace. I feel it. From the moment I saw you, I felt it in my bones. I've lived with regret for decades, but nothing has haunted me more than the thought that I might have destroyed something beautiful, that I might have driven away a girl who would become you." Grace felt tears sting her eyes before she could stop them. All her life, she'd wondered where she came from. Her father, the man who raised her, had done his best, but he had never spoken of her mother's world. And now here it was, laid before her like a forgotten photograph suddenly restored. She was someone's granddaughter. Someone's legacy. But how can you be sure? Grace asked, her voice cracking. All you have is a photo, a guess. Eleanor nodded slowly. You're right. That's why I'm not asking for anything. Not yet. Just a chance to know you. And if you'll allow it, we can confirm everything with time. Grace stared down at her hands, at the chipped polish on her thumbnail, at the way they trembled without permission. The room felt too quiet again. Her world, once small and reliable, now spun with questions. Could this woman really be her grandmother? Could the Admiral, the man who collapsed just feet away, be her father? She rose from the couch slowly, not to leave, but to walk toward the painting above the fireplace. It was a seascape, muted blues and stormy grays, with a single lighthouse in the distance. Did she paint that? Grace asked softly. Eleanor looked up, eyes glassy. Yes. It was the last one she ever gave Thomas. He kept it here after she left. Grace swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. And no one knew she had a child? Eleanor shook her head. Not a soul. If she told anyone, they never came forward. And by the time I considered that possibility, it was too late. She had vanished. They sat together in silence, the space between them not empty, but full of words still unspoken. The clock ticked on, but time seemed to move differently now, not forward, but backward, into memories neither of them had lived together, but both had carried. Eleanor finally reached into a drawer beneath the tea tray and pulled out another photo, one Grace had never seen. It was a grainy snapshot of Thomas and Lillian on a picnic blanket, laughing like two people who believed the world would always be kind. Grace touched the edge of the photo. She looks happy here. She was, Eleanor said quietly. Until I took that from her. They parted with no promises, just the soft echo of something beginning. Eleanor walked Grace to the door and handed her a folded piece of parchment. If you ever want to talk or ask anything, I'm here. Always. Grace nodded, still too full to speak, and stepped back into the evening. The sky was darker now, the stars beginning to peek through the haze. Grace stood on the porch for a moment, the air cool against her face. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether any of this would hold up under scrutiny. But she did know one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again. Have you ever discovered something about your past that changed how you saw yourself? How did it shape your future? If Grace's journey stirred something in you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell us, do you believe family is defined more by blood or by the love we choose to give? The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the only sound in the private recovery room, its soft beeping a quiet declaration that Admiral Thomas Wright was still alive, even if the past had nearly stolen his breath. Pale beneath the starch of hospital linens, his frame looked smaller now, as though the collapse had stripped away the title and left only the man. Outside the window, the city moved on without him, its noise muffled by double-paned glass and decades of discipline. But inside the room, time had folded in on itself. And the woman standing at his bedside was no longer just his mother. She was the keeper of a truth she could no longer contain. She's alive, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the machine's hum. Her pearls lay askew against her collarbone, her hands clutched tightly in front of her. And she's here. Her name is Grace. Thomas turned his head slightly, his brows furrowing as he processed the words. But it wasn't confusion that filled his face, it was something closer to resignation. You've seen her, he said softly, more statement than question. Eleanor nodded, tears pooling but not yet falling. At the Harbor Club. She served us tea. Her voice cracked. And when I looked at her, it was like looking at a memory I never deserved to forget. Thomas closed his eyes, a tremor in his jaw. I always wondered if I would, he murmured. If I'd ever see her or someone who might be her. His voice, normally composed and commanding, wavered like a man remembering a war that no one else saw. I found out Lillian was pregnant, he said at last. But it was too late. Eleanor stiffened, her breath catching. You knew? Thomas nodded, eyes still closed. A letter came. Not from her, from a friend. She never told me herself. And you didn't say anything, Eleanor said, voice rising. Not to me. Not to anyone. He opened his eyes now, and there was no uniform in his expression, only a son staring at the woman who'd made him choose. Because I knew what you'd do, he said. You destroyed that relationship, Mother. You told me she wasn't fit. That love wasn't enough. The words hit like gunfire, and Eleanor flinched beneath them. I was trying to protect you, she whispered, but it sounded hollow even to her own ears. From scandal. From ruin. No, Thomas replied, his voice like gravel. You were trying to protect our name. And in doing so, you cost me everything. Silence stretched between them, brittle and sharp. I searched, he continued. After she died, I looked everywhere. Hired people. Pulled records. But I was told the baby died too. Miscarriage, they said. Or maybe stillbirth. No one could give me a straight answer. His jaw tightened. So I let it go. Or at least I tried. Eleanor sank into the visitor's chair beside the bed, finally allowing the tears to fall. I believed I'd buried a mistake. But now I know it was a miracle I buried alive. Her voice trembled as she reached for his hand. Grace is everything Lillian was. Strong. Poised. Kind. And she has your eyes. Thomas's throat tightened, but he said nothing. The beeping of the monitor carried on, oblivious to the decades collapsing between them. She thinks her mother died when she was a baby, Eleanor said, twisting the truth between her fingers. That's all the man who raised her ever told her. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, then stopped, realizing for the first time how little he had left to offer. I need to meet her, he said finally. Not as an admiral. Not even as her father. Just as a man who owes her the truth. Eleanor nodded, her hand still gripping his. She doesn't know yet, she said. Not fully. But she suspects. Thomas exhaled slowly, the weight of hidden years pressing deeper into his chest than any heart attack ever could. What must she think of us? Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words. She doesn't think of us at all. Not yet. Her life was quiet, and we tore it open. Thomas turned his gaze toward the ceiling, his eyes glassy. I abandoned her before I ever held her. I chose my commission. I chose silence. Eleanor looked at him, pain rippling through her features. No, I chose. You were just too loyal to stop me. The room fell quiet again, filled only by the echoes of things they couldn't change. She should hate us, Eleanor said at last. And maybe she will. She has every right to, Thomas replied. But that doesn't change what I need to do. I need to see her. I need to tell her the truth from me. Eleanor nodded, rising slowly from her chair. I'll speak with her again, she said. Gently. She paused at the doorway, hand on the frame. You still have time, Thomas. But don't wait too long. She's waited long enough. When she was gone, Thomas lay back against the pillows, the hospital lights blurring above him. He thought of Lillian, the sound of her laugh, the way her hands moved when she painted, the freckles on her shoulder. He had never stopped seeing her. And now, the thought that a piece of her still existed, that her daughter had grown into a woman strong enough to confront the silence, filled him with a kind of grief that didn't know where to land. He reached for the nurse's button, then hesitated, letting his hand fall back to the blanket. There would be time for tests, for proof, for blood and paper and DNA. But his heart already knew. And what scared him most wasn't whether Grace was his daughter, it was whether she'd ever want him to be her father. The corridor was quieter than Grace expected, almost too still for a place that carried so much pain. The private wing of the hospital felt like a sanctuary wrapped in white walls and muffled footsteps, tucked far from the chaos of emergency rooms and waiting areas. She clutched her coat a little tighter, the letter from Eleanor still folded neatly in her pocket. The request had been clear. He wants to see you. No expectations, just the truth. And yet every step toward his room felt heavier than the last. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Her reflection in the small window looked calm, but her heart said otherwise. Grace had always wondered about the man her mother never spoke of, had crafted stories in her head of someone far away, maybe already gone. But this man wasn't a story anymore. He was real. And he was waiting. She knocked once, gently, before pushing the door open. The man lying in the bed was thinner than she remembered, his once formidable posture softened by recovery. But his eyes, sharp, weary, and startlingly familiar, lifted to meet hers the second she entered. Grace, he said, almost reverently, like the word itself might break if spoken too loud. She didn't respond. She simply walked to the chair and sat down. They stared at each other for a long time, the silence a language of its own. Grace folded her arms tightly, her jaw tense, waiting for him to speak. He looked like he wanted to stand, but the wires and his condition pinned him in place. Finally, with a shallow breath, he said, "You have your mother's eyes." Grace flinched, just slightly. "Don't," she said, her voice low. "Don't pretend you knew her like I did." Thomas nodded slowly, not in defense, but in acknowledgement. "You're right," he said. "You knew her better. But I loved her, even if I never earned the right to say it." Grace's fingers curled into her sleeves, holding back the storm building beneath her calm. "Then why did you leave her?" she asked. "Why did she die alone, raising me in silence while you got to wear medals and speeches?" Her voice didn't rise, but every word cut with precision. "She never told me your name. Do you know what that feels like?" Thomas looked away, the weight of his choices dragging against his breath. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I let others, my mother, the Navy, reputation, decide who I could love. I thought I was protecting her by staying away. But that protection turned into abandonment. And I'll never forgive myself for that." Grace sat back, the words hanging between them like smoke. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. But all she did was ask, "Did you know about me?" Thomas hesitated just a moment too long. "I found out, just before Lillian died," he said quietly. "I was told she was pregnant. I tried to find her, but by the time I did, I was told the child hadn't survived. I believed it. Or maybe I wanted to." "That's not good enough," Grace whispered. "That's not even close." Her voice wavered now, the cracks showing. "She did survive. I did. And while you were living your life, we were scraping by, praying my father's cough didn't turn into something worse." Thomas leaned forward, pain etched deep into his features. "I didn't stop thinking about her. Or you. I checked every few years, no records, no trace. Eventually, I started sending support anonymously. Your guardian, the man who raised you, I made sure he had help." Grace blinked, stunned. "That was you." Thomas nodded. "It was all I could offer, without breaking everything else." "You mean without breaking your image," she snapped. "Because being a father in secret is cleaner than being one out loud." The bitterness came fast now, too long buried. "You knew where I was. You could have come. You just didn't." Thomas didn't argue. He didn't beg. "You're right," he said. "And if I were in your place, I wouldn't forgive me either. But I'm here now because I can't let another day pass with silence." Grace stood, shaking. "You don't get to walk into my life with a confession and expect me to just feel something," she said. "I'm not a secret anymore. I'm not some shadow of a past you regret." She turned toward the door, tears hot behind her eyes. "I came here because I needed to hear the truth. Not to heal you." "Grace," Thomas said, voice barely above a whisper, "I don't expect you to stay. I just needed you to know. I never stopped wishing I had the courage back then to fight for her. And for you." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, but didn't turn around. "I'll give you space," he said. "All I ask is that you take a test. A DNA test. Not for me, but for you. So that no one can lie to you ever again." Grace swallowed hard, her shoulders trembling. She hated that she wanted to know. Hated that a part of her, small, stubborn, scared, needed confirmation of what her heart already suspected. She didn't answer. She just opened the door and walked out. Eleanor was waiting in the corridor, her face tight with worry. Grace didn't say anything at first, just brushed past her toward the elevator. "He told you," Eleanor said gently. "Everything." Grace turned slowly. "He told me enough. But not what I needed to hear." "I understand," Eleanor replied. "He's had a lifetime of hiding. But that's over now. If you need proof, we can get it. I'll arrange the test." Grace nodded once, her lips pressed into a hard line. "Do it," she said. "Let's make sure we're not all just clinging to a story that hurts." Then she stepped into the elevator and disappeared behind closing doors. Eleanor stood alone in the hallway, her pearls resting heavily against her chest. She'd thought the truth would heal, but now she saw it was only the beginning. The test wouldn't fix everything, but maybe it could clear the fog she had helped create. And if they were lucky, it might even open a door that had been closed for far too long. Can forgiveness truly begin if the truth only arrives after years of silence? If this chapter struck a chord with you, let us know in the comments. What would you do if the person who abandoned your family came back with answers? The sterile smell of the clinic lingered on Grace's skin long after she left, like truth had its own scent and wouldn't let go. The DNA test had been quick, a cheek swab, a signature, a few stiff instructions, but nothing about it felt simple. As she rode the bus back to her neighborhood, her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, tugging at threads as if unraveling something might give her peace. She hadn't told her father she went. He was having a good day, and Grace didn't want to poison it with uncertainty she hadn't yet decided she wanted answered. Back at the cafe, everything looked the same, the cracked tile by the register, the smell of cinnamon and old coffee grounds, the regulars who never tipped enough. But Grace wasn't the same. Her smile felt thinner, her voice flatter, like she was pretending to be a version of herself that had quietly vanished the moment Eleanor said her mother's name. Every time a customer looked at her too long, she wondered if they knew, if the story had gotten out. Is that the Admiral's daughter? The secret one? She carried plates with hands that trembled when no one was looking. Her coworkers had stopped whispering, but only because they were watching. Not with judgment, but curiosity, the kind that made her skin itch. She felt like she was walking around in a borrowed life, waiting for someone to either rip it away or confirm it belonged to her all along. Every shift was heavier now, as if each order, each refill, pressed harder against something already cracked. Eleanor came in on a Tuesday. She sat at a corner table, dressed simply, no pearls, no makeup, just a navy cardigan and soft gray scarf. Grace nearly dropped a tray when she saw her, but Eleanor didn't wave or call out. She just sat there, quiet and still, as if trying not to startle something fragile. When Grace finally approached with a coffee pot in hand, Eleanor looked up with gentle eyes. "May I?" she asked, not for coffee, but for a conversation Grace hadn't yet agreed to. Grace poured without answering. Her hands were steady this time, though she felt her chest tighten with every passing second. "You didn't have to come here," she said flatly, her tone low enough to avoid attention. "I know," Eleanor replied, "but I wanted to see where you live your life. Not from a photo. From your world." Grace said nothing, just left the check on the table and walked away. But she watched Eleanor from the corner of her eye, saw how she noticed the chipped mug, how she smiled kindly at the waitress in training who spilled a napkin dispenser, how she folded her hands on her lap like she didn't belong and knew it. Grace hated how that made her heart soften. Hated how she didn't want to send her away. That night, the envelope arrived. No return address, just her name, typed, not handwritten. She stared at it for almost an hour, her hands sweaty, her breathing shallow, her heart pounded with something between dread and hope. Then, finally, she opened it. Match, 99.99%, biological relationship confirmed. Thomas Wright is your biological father. The words didn't shout. They didn't scream. They just sat there, silent and certain, as if they had always known. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, the paper crumpling in her grip as tears spilled before she could stop them. Not because it was shocking, but because it wasn't. She had known the moment she looked into his eyes. She had known when Eleanor first said Lillian's name. But seeing it in ink, undeniable and permanent, made something break in her that she hadn't even realized was whole. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was something worse, hollow. The photo of her mother still sat on her desk, folded, worn, always close. Grace picked it up and stared, her tears dripping onto the corner. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Why did you leave me with questions instead of answers?" Her mother's face gave nothing in return. Just that quiet, tired smile. The next day, Grace went back to work, but she felt like she was moving through someone else's routine. The blender was too loud, the lights too bright. Even the voices around her felt distant, like they belonged in a world she was no longer part of. When Eleanor came in again, Grace didn't hide. She brought her a coffee without asking and sat across from her. "I got the results," she said simply. Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the mug. I know, Grace added. It's true. Eleanor nodded slowly, tears forming again. I never doubted, she whispered. Grace looked away, her voice sharp. Well, I did. And now I don't know what to do with the truth. She folded her hands in her lap, fighting the urge to cry again. I'm not angry. I'm adrift. I spent my whole life not knowing who I was. Now I know, and I don't know what that makes me. You're still Grace, Eleanor said gently. Still kind. Still strong, but now I'm also his, Grace snapped. A man who let my mother raise me alone. A man who hid me. Eleanor didn't respond right away, and Grace appreciated that the silence felt honest. I didn't come here for comfort, she added. I came because I needed to say it out loud. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in silk. This was your mother's, she said, placing it on the table. Grace hesitated, then unwrapped it, a delicate charm bracelet, tarnished but beautiful. One charm was a tiny anchor, another a paintbrush. Grace's breath hitched. She made it while she was pregnant, Eleanor said softly. Said it would be for the baby she hoped would never feel adrift. Grace blinked back tears. The irony was too cruel. And yet, the gesture felt like a lifeline, something to hold on to in the chaos of identity. Grace stood, the bracelet clenched tightly in her fist. I don't know if I can forgive either of you, she said, voice raw. But I do want answers. Not the pretty kind. The real ones. Eleanor stood too, her eyes shining with relief. Then come, she said. We'll begin there. Grace stood in the grand living room of Eleanor's estate, her fingers brushing the edge of a piano that hadn't been played in years. The air inside was hushed, almost reverent, as if even the walls remembered things better left unsaid. Eleanor poured tea again, this time with less formality, her hands trembling only slightly. Across the room, Thomas sat in an armchair by the fire, his gaze not on Grace, but on something far away. Something buried. I suppose we owe you the whole truth, Eleanor said, sitting slowly, her eyes meeting Grace's with quiet resolve. Grace didn't answer. She simply nodded. The anchor charm on her mother's bracelet pressed against her wrist, as if urging her to listen. So she did. It started at a Navy gala, Eleanor began. One of those formal events where everyone wears dress whites and pretends rank doesn't divide them. Thomas gave a slight, rueful smile. She wasn't supposed to be there, he said. She was the hired artist, painting live portraits for the wives. I saw her across the room, laughing with her paint-splattered apron still tied around her cocktail dress. She spilled wine on a commander's wife, Thomas added, the corner of his mouth twitching. And then charmed her out of being angry. Eleanor sighed. That's what worried me from the start. She didn't follow rules. She disrupted the order we'd all learned to live inside. Grace tilted her head, her voice low. You mean she didn't belong? Eleanor flinched, but nodded. Yes, that's what I told myself. But what I meant was she wasn't one of us. Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped. We started writing letters after that night. Dozens of them. She said things I'd never heard about beauty, about freedom, about living life as if the world didn't own you. Grace felt something stir in her chest, an ache she hadn't named. She loved the ocean, Thomas continued. But only from the shore. She said the sea looked too beautiful to trust. Eleanor looked away then, her voice quieter. You'd sneak off base to see her. I would, Thomas admitted. We'd walk along the coastline. She'd sketch me when she thought I wasn't looking. I never felt more human than I did in those moments. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, picturing it, her mother in a sundress, pencil tucked behind her ear, barefoot in the sand with a man who would never be hers. Then why end it? She asked. Why not fight for her? Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. Because I made him believe he couldn't. I told him the Navy would never promote a man who defied the order of things, Eleanor confessed. That being with her would be career suicide. That it would ruin everything we'd built as a family. Thomas didn't interrupt. He just nodded, shame tightening his jaw. I was young, he said. And afraid of losing both my future and my family. Grace's breath caught. So you gave her up. I did, he said. but not because I stopped loving her. Because I didn't know how to be brave. Eleanor's voice cracked. And I didn't know how to let go of control. She left a letter, Thomas continued. She didn't ask for anything. Just said goodbye. Said she hoped the world would be kinder to our child than it had been to us. Grace's heart lurched. So she told you about me? She hinted, he said. But I didn't understand until after she was gone. Eleanor wiped a tear that had slipped down her cheek. I tried to find her, she said. Years later. After the guilt caught up with me. Grace turned to her, shocked. You what? I hired someone. Followed rumors. But by then, there was no trail left to follow. I never imagined she'd change her name, Eleanor added. But she had. She'd become someone new. She'd disappeared to protect you. Grace's voice was brittle. And all this time, I thought she had no one. Thomas's eyes met hers then, full of sorrow. She did have someone. She had you. The fire crackled, the only sound in a room heavy with remembrance. Grace's throat tightened. Why didn't she tell me? Maybe she wanted to protect you from who we were, Eleanor whispered. From the pain. From the lies. Or maybe, Grace said, she thought I wouldn't be welcome. Thomas stood slowly, walking toward the old seascape painting above the fireplace, the same one Grace had noticed weeks earlier. She painted this, he said. Gave it to me the night we said goodbye. He touched the canvas gently. I never hung it until after she was gone. I couldn't look at it without remembering what I lost. Grace stared at the brushstrokes, the way the sea curled toward the horizon, wild and endless. I always wondered why I loved painting so much, she said softly. Why I felt calmer near water. Eleanor rose from her seat and placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. Because you carry her, she said, in ways even she never expected. I don't know what to do with all of this, Grace admitted. It's too much. Thomas nodded. I understand. But you don't have to decide now. Just let yourself feel it. Grace closed her eyes, the bracelet on her wrist cool against her skin. Her mother's anchored charm felt heavier than ever. I don't hate you, she said finally. Not yet. But I haven't forgiven you either. You don't have to, Eleanor replied. We'll hold whatever space you need. Thomas took a shaky breath. Just don't walk away. Not yet. Grace looked around the room once more, at the ghosts of a life she never lived, at the stories told too late. The weight of the past sat on her shoulders, pressing into every thought. But beneath it, something else stirred, not forgiveness, not acceptance, but possibility. I'll come back, she said. But next time, I want to know more. About her. About all of it. Eleanor and Thomas both nodded, their silence a fragile sort of promise. The invitation came handwritten on cream stationery, just like the first note Eleanor had sent weeks ago, only this time, the message was not just for Grace. It was addressed to her and the man she still called Dad, the one who had raised her through every storm without a drop of resentment. Grace hesitated before handing it to him, unsure how he would react. He read it slowly, his brow furrowing with each line, and then he set it down with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. I knew this day would come, he said simply, his voice quiet but without bitterness. They arrived at the Wright estate on a warm Saturday afternoon, the sun stretching long shadows across the brick pathway. Grace's father, dressed in his best button-up and slacks, shifted uncomfortably beside her as they approached the grand front steps. She touched his arm briefly, a silent thank you for showing up, for not retreating. The door opened before they knocked. Eleanor stood there in soft tones, slate-gray trousers, and a pearl-button blouse. No jewelry, no airs, just a woman welcoming the girl she lost and the man who stepped in. Mr. Reed, she said, nodding with a warmth that caught him off guard. I'm grateful you came. He nodded politely, removing his cap. Thank you for having us, he replied. Grace speaks highly of you. Eleanor smiled faintly, a flicker of both regret and relief passing through her eyes. She's more gracious than I deserve. They stepped inside together, the contrast stark, one man built of calluses and work boots, now standing among crystal chandeliers and curated art. Grace watched her father take in the space, noting how his eyes lingered not on the luxury, but on the photographs. This was your world, he asked softly. She nodded. It was hers too, once. Kind of. Thomas waited in the library. No uniform in sight, just a plain shirt and the face of a man stripped of position. When Grace and her father entered, he stood, not tall like an admiral, but small like someone bracing for whatever judgment might come. "Mr. Reed," Thomas said, offering his hand. "Thank you for everything." Grace's father looked at the hand for a second, then shook it. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said. "I did it because she was my daughter in every way that mattered." Thomas nodded solemnly. "And I failed her in every way that did." The silence that followed wasn't cold, it was respectful. A space made for truth. Grace stood between the two men who had shaped her life in opposite ways and realized how different they were, and yet how much they both had carried. "I never tried to replace you," Thomas said, looking at Grace. "But I know now that absence doesn't excuse silence. I can't rewrite what I didn't do. I can only own it." Her father stepped back, giving her space to speak, but she said nothing, not yet. They moved into the sitting room, where Eleanor had laid out a light lunch. Grace sat near the window, her eyes drifting to the garden beyond, a space she hadn't explored yet. The conversation stayed soft, mostly about neutral things: her work schedule, her father's health, the cafe's customers. And then Eleanor touched Grace's hand and asked, "Would you like to see the garden?" Grace nodded, suddenly eager for fresh air. They walked the gravel path in silence, just the two of them, winding past flower beds and rose trellises that looked too perfectly arranged to be wild. "It didn't always look like this," Eleanor said, her steps slow but steady. "After Lillian left, I couldn't bear to change the yard. But when I realized I'd never see her again, I started planting things." She paused at a wooden bench beneath a weeping willow. "This is where she used to sit when she visited." Grace ran her fingers over the worn armrest, picturing her mother here, young, hopeful, unaware of the heartbreak ahead. "You made this for her?" she asked. Eleanor nodded. "And for you, though I didn't know it at the time." A breeze rustled the petals around them, and Grace inhaled deeply, her heart full but aching. "She never came back here," Grace whispered. "Not even to show me where she came from." "She was protecting you," Eleanor said. "From us. From all this." Grace sat down on the bench. It wasn't enough. "No," Eleanor agreed. But it was all she had to give. Thomas joined them later, walking slower than usual, his steps careful. He didn't speak right away, just sat beside Eleanor and looked out over the garden. "She used to hum when she painted," he said. "Always out of tune, but soft." Grace closed her eyes, letting that detail settle somewhere deep inside her. "This family is broken," Grace said, her voice cracking only slightly. "But so was mine. Maybe still is." She looked between them, her eyes softening. "But we're trying. And I think that counts for something." Eleanor reached for her hand again, holding it lightly. "You don't owe us anything," she said. "But if you want it, if you choose it, we want to be part of your life." Grace nodded, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. "Not yes. Not no. Just maybe." Her father stood on the porch as she returned from the garden, a quiet look of reflection on his face. "It's a beautiful place," he said. "Too quiet, maybe, but beautiful." Grace leaned into his side. "She never saw it," she murmured. "But maybe she would have liked it." They stayed a little longer, long enough to see the garden in golden light. Grace walked through it one more time, touching each bloom like she was meeting her mother's memories in pieces. When they left, there were no promises, just a shared understanding that something had shifted. The silence between them wasn't gone, but it had thinned. And in its place, something softer had begun to grow. Have you ever stood somewhere and felt the presence of someone you lost, as if a piece of them had been waiting there all along? We'd love to know what places in your life carry memories that words alone can't hold. Share your story in the comments. The sky was pale with the soft promise of morning when Grace returned to the Wright estate. The garden was still wet with dew, the air perfumed with roses and quiet memories. She didn't know why she came so early, only that something inside her had stirred all night like pages begging to be turned. Eleanor was already outside, seated beneath the weeping willow, a thick, worn journal resting in her lap. "There's something you need to read," she said without preamble, her voice both fragile and certain. She held the journal out with both hands, careful as if it were something sacred. It smelled faintly of old ink and lavender, and inside, between sketches of seascapes and pencil portraits, lay a folded letter. Grace touched it like it might disappear. The envelope was yellowed but intact, her name written not as Grace, but as to the daughter I'll never know. Her breath caught in her chest, and for a long moment, she simply stared. "I found it tucked behind a canvas," Eleanor said gently. "Last week." I hadn't looked through her journals in years. Grace opened the envelope slowly, her hands trembling as the paper crackled under her fingertips. Thomas appeared then, walking slowly toward them with a blanket draped over his arm. He said nothing, but his eyes, already red, told her he knew what she was holding. With both of them seated beside her now, Grace unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "My darling girl, if you're holding this, then somehow, you found your way to the place I once stood. I don't know who raised you or what name you learned first, but I hope you were loved. I hope someone brushed your hair and told you your laughter mattered. I hope your heart is still wild and soft, and your eyes still reflect the sea." Grace's voice quivered, but she continued. "I was scared when I carried you. Not of you, never of you, but of the world. I didn't know how to give you everything you deserved, but I knew what I needed to protect you from. I left behind a name, a man, and a life I once thought I couldn't live without. I left behind love, and I carried you forward instead." Thomas bowed his head, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "If they ever tell you that I ran, know that it was toward you, not away. Every painting I made, every sketchbook I filled, I did it with the thought that maybe someday you'd find me through the strokes. Maybe you'd feel me in the color. Maybe you'd know, somehow, that I never stopped loving you." Eleanor began to weep quietly beside her, the handkerchief in her palm crumpled and soaked. "To the man I left behind, if you're hearing this too, I hope you've changed. I hope you learned that love doesn't come with rank or rules. I hope you know that I forgave you a long time ago, not because you deserved it, but because I had to move forward with love in my heart, not pain. Our child deserved that." Grace's voice faltered again, and Thomas finally let go of the tears he had been holding in for years. "To you, my daughter, live fully. Live loudly. Don't let the silence I lived in define you. Build something brighter than the life I left behind. And if you ever feel lost, look toward the water. I'll be there. Always. With everything I was and everything I hoped you'd become, your mother, Lillian." The paper slipped from Grace's hands and fluttered into her lap like a petal from a tree. She was crying now, not out of grief, but from the strange, aching warmth of being seen. For the first time in her life, she felt like a question had been answered. Not by science or secrets, but by the voice of the woman who had loved her from afar. She looked to Eleanor, then to Thomas, and what she saw was not regret, but recognition. "I hear her," Grace whispered, wiping her cheeks. "I hear her in every word." Thomas reached forward, not with authority, but with care. "She was braver than both of us," he said. "She gave you everything she had." Eleanor leaned in, her voice trembling. "And now, we want to give you whatever we can. If you'll have us." Grace nodded, unable to speak. For once, the silence around them didn't feel cold. It felt full of possibility, of remembrance, of something like home. Later that afternoon, the three of them walked together to the farthest end of the garden, where a single cherry blossom tree stood in bloom. "This is where she used to sketch," Eleanor said. "Always this tree." Grace knelt in the grass and laid a single white lily at its base, the first flower she had ever left for her mother. The wind picked up gently, rustling the petals above them. "She never got to come back here," Grace said. "But I think she's here now." Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, and this time, Grace didn't pull away. "She never left," he said softly. "She just waited for the rest of us to catch up." The three of them stood in silence, the sun casting long shadows over the garden, as if time itself had paused to honor the moment. Grace didn't know what the next day would bring, whether healing would be easy or slow, whether trust would bloom or fracture again. But in that moment, standing at the roots of the tree her mother once loved, she felt something shift. She was no longer a stranger to her own story. She was Grace, daughter of Lillian. and no longer alone. The Navy band played in measured harmony, their instruments polished and glinting beneath the late afternoon sun. Rows of dignitaries, officers, and press lined the grounds of the ceremonial deck, their uniforms crisp and collars high. Flags fluttered softly behind the podium as Admiral Thomas Wright stood in full-dress whites for the final time. Beside the front row, just out of the spotlight but not hidden, Grace stood with Eleanor, her hair pinned back, her shoulders straight, her heart steady. She didn't wear anything flashy, just a simple navy blue dress and her mother's charm bracelet, now cleaned and restored, glinting gently at her wrist. She felt the glances, the half-whispers. That's her, the waitress. The daughter. The secret. But this time, they didn't make her shrink. They didn't make her flinch. She met each curious stare with calm resolve, not because she owed them an explanation, but because she no longer owed herself shame. Thomas stepped to the podium with measured steps, his face composed but not hardened. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed briefly on Grace, and in that split second, something softened. No one else would have noticed the tremor in his breath, or the way his voice almost caught as he began. "Today marks the end of my command," he said, "but not the end of what I've learned." He paused, then added, "Some lessons come from the Navy. Others come later and cut deeper." He spoke of service, of country, of the weight of silence and the cost of loyalty. But threaded between the formalities was something more vulnerable, a confession in disguise. "I've made choices I thought were for the good of the mission," he said, "only to learn that some missions don't involve battleships or medals, they involve making things right with the people you failed." He never said her name. He didn't have to. When he stepped down, the applause was respectful, but Grace felt something in it shift, as if those gathered had heard something more than retirement. Eleanor clutched her arm gently, her grip firm, steady. "He meant every word," she whispered. Grace nodded, eyes still on the stage. "I know," she said. "And for once, I believe him." After the ceremony, they didn't linger. They slipped away before the photo ops and the press questions, before the Navy dinners and champagne toasts. Back in Eleanor's garden, the world felt quiet again, not empty, but calm. The willow tree swayed in the breeze, its shadow long and gentle across the grass. Grace stepped out of her shoes and walked barefoot down the path. Thomas joined her, no longer in uniform, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his expression unguarded. "You came," he said simply. Grace looked at him, her lips tilting into a smile. "You showed up first," she replied. There was nothing left to argue about. They had all said what needed to be said. Eleanor brought out a tray with 3 cups of tea, just like she used to in the old days before everything cracked. They sat on the garden bench beneath the tree, the silence between them no longer brittle, but healing. Grace sipped slowly, the warmth grounding her, the smell of jasmine familiar. Birds chirped overhead, and for once, no one spoke first. It wasn't discomfort. It was peace. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "This belonged to my father," he said, opening it to reveal a silver compass, tarnished with time. "He gave it to me when I was 15. Said it would help me find my way, even when the stars didn't show." He handed it to Grace. "I think it's time it helped someone else." She took it slowly, her fingers curling around its edges. The metal was cool, worn, and impossibly heavy with meaning. "I may never wear the uniform," she said quietly, her eyes locked on the compass. "But I think I still inherited something from him." Eleanor smiled through glassy eyes. "And from her, too." They sat until the sun dipped low, casting gold across the flowers. Grace stood and stepped toward the cherry blossom tree, now in full bloom. She knelt again, just like she had before, and placed the compass gently beneath the roots. "She found her way," she whispered. "Now I will, too." Eleanor and Thomas remained behind her, giving her space, giving her the moment. For once, no one tried to define her by titles, bloodlines, or scandal. She wasn't just a secret revealed or a girl found late. She was Grace, wholly herself, with parts of others inside her, yes, but her own compass now in hand. And when she turned back toward them, the smile she wore didn't hide anything. It was real. Earned. Home. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.